to another explainer. Welcome to another explainer. Today, we're unpacking something incredibly fascinating, the Islamic ritual prayer. Specifically, we're zeroing in on the foundational Two-Rak'ah unit. Now, from the outside looking in, it might just seem like a standard everyday routine. But the reality? It's a profound, meticulously designed matrix of physical discipline, linguistic precision, and deep spiritual intent. We're going to break down the anatomy of this prayer step by step so we can really understand the brilliant legal framework and the rich theological weight behind every single motion. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's the chronological journey we'll take today. 1. Preparation and core rules. 2. Executing the first rak'ah. 3. The second rak'ah. 4. The final sitting. And 5. Rectifying errors and extras.
Section 1. Preparation and core rules. To really grasp how the mechanics work here, we first need to look at the taxonomy of the prayer components. Basically, Islamic jurisprudence categorizes the actions into 3 distinct legal buckets. First, you've got Shurut. These are your non-negotiable external prerequisites, things like physical purity and facing Mecca. Then, within the prayer itself, we have Arkan, which are the absolute structural pillars of the ritual. And finally, Wajibat, the obligatory acts. Understanding this exact structure is literally the key to unlocking how the entire legal framework operates.
So what happens when human error inevitably pops up? Well, think of it like a physical building. If you miss an arkan, a structural pillar, the prayer completely collapses. It's invalidated, and that specific unit has to be physically repeated. But if you miss a wajibat, an obligatory act, the structural integrity is actually still there. The prayer remains valid and can be elegantly fixed later at the very end with a prostration of forgetfulness. It's this really brilliant balance between strict structural law and, practical human fallibility.
Now, it's super interesting to note that the 4 primary Sunni schools of thought, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, actually enumerate these absolute pillars differently. The Hanafi school emphasizes 7 core pillars, while the Shafi'i and Hanbali schools break them all the way down into 13 and 14 distinct pillars. The Maliki school, meanwhile, puts a massive stress on continuous tranquility in every single posture. And we should point out, these aren't contradictions. It's just a rich, pluralistic legal tradition. They're all looking at the exact same prophetic evidence, but applying different methodological lenses to define that structural core.
Section 2. Executing the first rak'ah.
Okay, let's talk physical initiation, which involves 3 distinct actions. First is qiyam, standing perfectly upright. Next, rafa el-yaden, which is raising the hands to the ears or shoulders. This visually symbolizes tossing the material world completely behind you. Finally, the takbiratul ihram, pronouncing Allahu Akbar, or God is the greatest. This specific sequence acts as a profound psychological boundary. The moment you utter that phrase, you officially enter an inviolable sacred state. From that second on, worldly activities, eating, speaking, moving around unnecessarily, they become strictly prohibited.
Immediately after entering this sacred state, the worshiper silently recites an opening supplication just to center their heart. O Allah, distance me from my sins as you have distanced the east from the west. O Allah, purify me of my sins as a white garment is purified of dirt. I mean, just pause and reflect on that for a second. That deep internal state, it's a profound plea for absolute spiritual purification right at the starting line.
Now, what's really interesting about this next step is how the simple act of reciting the opening chapter has distinct juristic variations. The worshiper seeks refuge from Satan and begins reciting the Quran. While reciting the opening chapter, Surah Al-Fatiha, is universally recognized, how it's initiated varies. For instance, the Shafi'i school considers the opening Basmalah, in the name of Allah, to be the undisputed first verse, mandating it be recited out loud in audible prayers. On the flip side, the Hanafi, Maliki, and Hanbali schools advise keeping it silent. The Hanafi school even uniquely categorizes Al-Fatiha itself as a wajib, an obligation, rather than a strict pillar.
After the recitation, the physical descent begins. Step 1. The worshiper drops into Ruku, or bowing, and this requires real biomechanical precision. The back has to be perfectly horizontal and flat. Step 2. While stabilized there, uttering the tasbih, praising the magnificence of the Lord. Then step 3 is i'tidal, rising back up to a complete upright stance. And I absolutely have to emphasize here that physical tranquility during this rise and standing isn't just a suggestion, it's classified as an entirely independent pillar. You literally cannot rush this transition.
Right from that standing position, the worshipper descends directly to the ground for sujud, or prostration. This right here is the ultimate physical apex of humility and subjugation. The Prophet strictly mandated grounding exactly 7 specific bones simultaneously: the forehead and nose, both palms, both knees, and the toes of both feet. Because this represents the absolute closest proximity a person has to the divine, it's highly recommended to engage in unrestricted personal supplications here, before rising for a calm seated pause, the jilsa, and then descending for a second identical prostration.
Section 3. The second Rak'ah.
As the worshipper rises back up, the second Rak'ah builds immediately on the first and structurally mirrors it. You've got the standing recitation, the bowing, the 2 prostrations, but you'll notice a key difference at the very start. The second Rak'ah entirely omits the opening supplication and seeking refuge. Instead, the worshipper proceeds directly into the Basmalah and the Quranic recitation. Why? To maintain the seamless momentum and the uninterrupted flow of the worship.
Section 4. The final sitting.
So, after the second prostration, the worshipper sits and recites the Tashahhud. This is a text with massive historical and theological significance. It translates to, "All compliments, prayers, and pure words are due to Allah. Peace be upon you, O Prophet, and the mercy of Allah and His blessings." This recitation actually represents the dialogue of reverence and peace that was purportedly exchanged during the Prophet Muhammad's heavenly ascension. Both the physical act of sitting for this phase and verbally reciting this text are indispensable pillars of the prayer.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how deep the methodology goes. During the Tashahhud, positioning the right hand and moving the index finger is an established practice to physically affirm monotheism. But the interpretations of this micro-movement are wild. The Hanafi school raises it to negate false gods and lowers it to affirm Allah. The Shafi'i school raises it at the affirmation and keeps it perfectly stationary. The Maliki school moves it gently and continuously left to right to aid focus. And the Hanbali school points it firmly every single time the specific name of Allah is uttered. It's just a single, tiny physical movement, but it encapsulates incredibly deep nuances across the 4 schools.
As this final sitting continues, we hit the last verbal steps before the prayer concludes. First, the worshipper sends specific salutations and blessings upon the Prophet, which is known as the Salat al-Ibrahimiyya. Next, it's highly recommended to seek divine protection from 4 specific existential trials, including the trials of life, death, and the false messiah. And finally, this is an optimal window for personal, pre-taslim supplications. This is the perfect time for those comprehensive pleas for forgiveness that the Prophet actively taught to his closest companions.
To formally exit this sacred state, the worshipper performs the taslim, which is the final pillar. The standard practice upheld by the vast majority of scholars involves 2 salutations. You turn your head completely to the right, stating peace be upon you and the mercy of Allah, and then turn to the left and repeat it. But there is a fascinating exception. The Maliki school permits concluding the prayer with a single salutation directed forward or slightly to the right. That's a ruling impartially stemming from specific historical practices observed early on in Medina. Either way, this vocalization definitively breaks the restriction. You are officially back in the mundane world.
Section 5. Rectifying errors and extras.
Now, human fallibility is inevitable, right? And the Sujud al-Sahu, or prostration of forgetfulness, acts as this highly logical if-then matrix to deal with it. If you omit a wajib, like missing that first sitting, the prayer is structurally deficient, so you perform 2 extra prostrations before the final taslim to repair the deficiency. However, if you accidentally add an extra movement, your prayer already has an excess, so you perform the corrective prostrations after the taslim to cleanly separate them from the core ritual. This exact same brilliant logic applies to dominant doubts, perfectly preserving the validity of the prayer without requiring a frustrating total restart. Another element of practice we should discuss involves historical juristic recommendations regarding gender distinctions in posture. Now, the overarching baseline is that the sequence applies equally to men and women, based on the Prophet's general command to pray exactly as he prayed. But, leaning on the principle of setr, concealment and modesty, early jurists advised distinct postures. Men were commanded to expand their posture during prostration, while women were advised to adopt a much more compact posture, drawing their limbs together. It is very important to mention, though, that modern scholars and hadith specialists actively debate the authenticity of the specific texts used to enforce these postural differences.
They note that a woman praying identically to a man maintains a perfectly valid prayer across all the schools.
What we've covered so far is the baseline for obligatory prayers. But this fundamental Two-Rak'ah paradigm scales up beautifully to fill a worshiper's entire day with massive spiritual reward. You have the Two-Rak'ahs of Sunnah before Fajr, you've got the Tahiyyat al-Masjid greeting upon entering a mosque, there's Salat al-Duha expressing gratitude in the morning, Tahajjud vigils in the deep night, and Salat al-Istihara when you're seeking divine guidance for life decisions. It's the exact same mechanical structure, simply transformed by intention into vastly different spiritual weights.
However, despite the immense reward of those extra prayers, Islamic jurisprudence delineates strictly prohibited times for executing uncaused voluntary prayers. Those are post-dawn until sunrise, the brief solar zenith at midday, and post-afternoon until sunset. These specific temporal restrictions serve a really brilliant dual purpose. First, they impose necessary boundaries that prevent spiritual burnout, and second, they aggressively differentiate Islamic monotheism from pagan sun-worshipping rituals that historically took place precisely during those solar transitions.
So, we've unpacked the prerequisites, the pillars, the divergences, and the incredibly precise physical and verbal choreography of these two units. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Does the meticulous, highly regulated physical structure of the Two-Rak'ah prayer constrain a person's devotion? Or is it exactly this rigorous outward discipline, removing the burden of figuring out how to worship, that actually sets the human mind completely free to achieve absolute, inward presence before the divine? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this breakdown was as fascinating for you to listen to as it was for me to share.